Welcome, I'm Cam Slater and you're listening to Inside Politics. In this episode I'm going to look at polling ahead of the 2002 election and compare those results with polling ahead of this year's election. This week the media presented their case to the Epidemic Response Committee and I'll dissect their self-serving responses in depth. Thank you for listening. The election date remains at September 19, and the last possible date for an election under our election laws is November 21. Any date after that requires a vote in the Parliament with 75% of MPs voting in favour. There have been no recent polls, but the word is that One News is currently in the field. Expect to see those numbers on Sunday evening or Monday. As I discussed last week, UMR's polling has leaked into the public domain and has been confirmed with reputable sources. The headline numbers were Labour on 49%, National on 35%, New Zealand First and the Greens both on 5% and ACT on 2%. On those numbers, Simon Bridges' gamble to rule out New Zealand First is still a busted flush. Even with New Zealand First, he can't form a government. But to make matters worse for Simon Bridges, Courier's internal polling has reportedly leaked out, showing Labour on 49%, National on 31%, the Greens on 9%, New Zealand First on 6%, and ACT on 5%. I don't believe those numbers are quite right, simply because David Farron never leaks, so that means somebody in the Type 5 of National is doing it and trying to create alarm in the leadership. Now, sure, I believe the large party numbers, maybe with National a couple of points higher, but I believe the Greens are actually much lower than that. Their support has been cannibalised by Labour. Nonetheless, there is no scenario that works for Simon Bridges and National. In fact, it points to electoral oblivion for them and a hard left Labour-Green government. There still remains the possibility that Labour would form a coalition with New Zealand First. It just depends on how far left Jacinda Ardern wants to lurch. In any case, National plus ACT is not enough, nowhere near enough. In fact, the loss is approaching the ignominious loss of Bill English in 2002 in terms of scale. At 31%, there would be almost no list MPs, and with a loss of that scale, many constituency seats would be lost as well. An examination of polling in 2002 suggests that National is about to fall off a cliff. In April 2002, TVNZ released their Colmar-Brunton poll that showed Labour on 50%, National on 34%, Greens on 6%, ACT on 4%, and New Zealand First on 3%. This is eerily similar to both UMR and Courier's polling for the National Party. Now, the election result in 2002 saw Labour drop to 41%, National on just under 21%, New Zealand First to 10%, and ACT and the Greens with 7% each. Labour slumped 9% between April and July, while National dropped 13%. The minor parties all benefited as a result. Now, I see no reason not to think that the same thing will happen in this year's election. In fact, I think it's now highly likely because of the impact of COVID-19. Bill English may yet get the worst result ever, monkey off his back, and hand that mantle to Simon Bridges. And you've got to know that Bill English is cheering Bridges on in that regard. Now, you know the National Party's polling is bad because of two things. One, the numbers are leaking, but also the numbers are not being shared with caucus. The leadership always shares good numbers, and they haven't shared any numbers for months. Courier polls every week for the National Party, especially in election year. Caucus really should be demanding their polling numbers because their political future depends on it. Another indicator that there is disquiet is the soft pushing via comments on Twitter, on Kiwi blog, and also here on the BFD, that there is a surprising level of support for Paul Goldsmith. I describe these comments as pure fantasy, mainly because Goldsmith, though very smart, He has, in fact, an appalling face-to-face demeanour. He's certainly very capable and intelligent, but to suggest he could lead National is pure fantasy. The wet wing of National is still pushing the Muller-Kay team, but given Todd Muller waited years before he could get a sure thing in the Bay of Plenty, shows a lack of confidence in his abilities. And Nikki Kay has only ever beaten a raw and untested Jacinda Ardern, so it doesn't fill one with confidence that they could succeed with a similar platform to Labour. Ardern would certainly give Kay a good smacking in a head-to-head election these days. A campaign that says to voters that National is like Labour but not quite as bad isn't really a winning combination. The correlation between polling in 2002 and 2020 shows eerie similarities, and those similarities are not good for National. Traditionally, large parties slump during the campaign and smaller parties rise. Looking back at 2002 with the TVNZ poll in April, New Zealand First had 3% in that poll, and I remember National supporters were gloating about Winston Peters getting his comeuppance. I should know, I was one of them. New Zealand First went on to get 10% in that campaign, no doubt at the expense of both Labour and National, as voters realised that National couldn't win, and so they went for a risk mitigation strategy. Now the Greens also rose between April and July, though but not by as much. The hallmarks are all there to be seen. We could be seeing an echo of 2002 in the 2020 election. What remains to be seen is if National Caucus can see the same similarities and act to try and stop it. Watching media lovies line up before the Epidemic Response Committee this week to bleat and moan was as unedifying as it was cringeworthy. One after the other, they all bemoaned the parlous state they find themselves in currently, and variously laid the blame for their predicament at the feet of global social media giants like Google and Facebook, or the fact that their advertising revenues have dwindled away to nothing. In a highlight of the previous day's committee meeting was Grant Robertson stating that these sorry cases suffering under COVID-19 impacted revenue constraints had underlying conditions.
It's an interesting example too, and you mentioned NZME. We do have to be careful about ascribing the problems of every business to COVID-19. The media sector is one where the patient had pre-existing conditions.
First up at the committee was Gavin Ellis, a former editor at the New Zealand Herald, back when they had a deserved reputation as the paper of record. Sadly, he has become a whining old coot, longing for the heydays of newspapers and their rivers of gold from classified advertising. Here are a few of his gripes.
We really are in an existential crisis here because advertising revenues in New Zealand are absolutely in free fall. I estimate the declines since the lockdown to have been between 50 and 75%, and no medium is exempt from that. That there may be a repeat of what happened after the GFC, where 30% of the advertising that was lost during the GFC simply didn't come back to traditional media. They're worried that there will be a return of that. Of course, the elephant in the room in all of this is the impact of the social media companies, Google, Facebook in particular, that are siphoning off at least 70% of the $1.26 billion spent on digital advertising each year. And it disturbs me that government uses these digital platforms, Google, Facebook, and so on, at an exponentially growing rate. And only a fraction of their digital spend is going to local media platforms.
Let's examine his initial issues. Firstly, the major media are the architects of their own demise when it comes to advertising revenue. When the internet started, the print media basically gave away their news for free. They assiduously protected their traditional paper-based advertising revenues based on their large circulations. They maintained expensive rates for print and gave away online advertising for cents on the dollar. They valued the medium that had the least amount of granularity for reporting. Essentially, the only metric available for measuring print advertising was circulation figures. Obviously, ad buyers started to question the value of this as circulation slipped away, but by this time those same ad buyers had been conditioned to only paying a few cents per 1,000 views for online ads. The online sites also allowed Google to sell ads into their sites, thereby undercutting their own ad revenue efforts. Even today, many of the ads on the New Zealand Herald and on Stuff are supplied by Google and are not direct sold by their own sales teams. So they discounted their online inventory, conditioned their customers to paying way less for online ads, and then they let Google in through the back door to fill their inventory. Customers soon learned they could buy and place ads on high-value sites cheaper via Google's ad networks. The existential crisis that Gavin Ellis talks about was created by their own actions. I'll come back to talk further about social media, but Gavin Ellis seems to think that they somehow have a better right to advertising spending from government than the platforms that actually have the audience. As David Farrar tweeted that this week, the government doesn't give money to Google or Facebook. It buys a service, and the reality is that you want to be able to target ads at specific populations, then they provide great value for money. And he's dead right. No one in New Zealand, in the New Zealand media landscape, can target their ads at specific demographics like Google, Twitter or Facebook can do. To suggest otherwise is the stuff of pure fantasy, which ironically is what most of their so-called news is in any case. Then Gavin Ellis goes on to suggest that despite poor business choices and planning and massive own goals, that the government should protect those same foolish businesses, and worse, they should protect them ahead of more nimble and modern businesses.
So, bottom line is that all commercial media are in trouble. Their needs are immediate. Without some help, there's no guarantee that that overall overarching institution of the media will survive in a form that's suitable for a free and democratic country like our own. We hear the refrain, government's not in the business of propping up failing enterprises. And, in normal times, I agree with that. But these aren't normal times, and news media are not normal enterprises. So I think there is a special case to be made. They're not too big to fail, but they certainly are too important to fail, certainly the main ones. Equally, it'd be folly, I think, to give more weight to new media than traditional media. Newspapers and linear television and radio are the engine rooms of journalism in this country. What is produced by those media outlets flows through to all of the digital outputs that we have, including, I might say, social media. The vast majority of posted news items on social media come from those traditional newsrooms. So we need to make sure that traditional media aren't disadvantaged in any help that's forthcoming.
That is nothing short of begging for subsidies to prop up their failed business models in order to protect them from their own misfortune. I can imagine a similar refrain from buggy whip manufacturers begging for a subsidy when cars were first coming on the market. I say let them fail. Nature and business abhors a vacuum, and so something will rise from the ashes. These media conglomerates long abandoned their audiences, and now they're crying over it. There seems to be a real keenness to allow the merger of NZME and Stuff. These fools think that their costs will be rationalised and their revenues will remain intact. That's pure folly. Businesses I've spoken to have told me that they'd cut their ad spend if there was only one main media outlet, irrespective of whether the new media entity would maintain the illusion of multiple sites. Moreover, they're more realistic about the length of the recovery and how much spare cash will be floating around for the discretionary spending. The biggest advertisers would currently be real estate and then the motor industry. both of those industries are going to see a massive retraction as a result of the likely worldwide depression foisted upon us by COVID-19. Sinead Bosher, the head of staff, showed just how out of touch she was with reality by launching into a rant about fake news.
Several examples of the social platforms fueling the spread of quite dangerous fake news and misinformation about the COVID virus, its causes and impact. Not just the 5G example, but 2 days before we actually went into lockdown, there was a rumour during the rounds on social that we were about to go into lockdown. Not a single news media company here in New Zealand reported that, but somehow everybody seemed to know about it and be talking about it and be preparing for it. And the spread of that kind of news, fake news, is being enabled and funded by the institutions and businesses that advertise on those platforms, and the government included there. But it's the news media that is devoting its resources through its journalism to exposing those lies and debunking the myths and presenting accurate and balanced coverage that people can trust.
In her mad rush to attack fake news, she completely missed the point that social media was in fact correct about the lockdown, and the media missed the boat entirely. Quite how she paints this as fake news and dangerous is beyond me. It was quite sensible to prepare for what was bleeding obvious, and it was also neither fake nor dangerous. Mind you, this is the same media outlet that screeches daily about the pending doom of climate change and refuses to entertain even quite reasonable debate on the topic. They are less news and more social activists in this regard, and they wonder why no one trusts them. You just have to look at their entirely negative coverage of Donald Trump to realise that again their demise has been at their own hands. None are more woke than Stuff, and the saying, go woke, get broke, has never been truer. Sinead Bosher then launches into an attack against Google and Facebook.
And we're competing against entities that are not operating under the same regulatory framework, paying the same tax against us, who are in many ways being rewarded through the spend of advertising money for some pretty bad behaviour in the terms of misinformation that they have spread over months and years. And I think one of the fallacies that we've all struggled against is that somehow those platforms need to be used by government and others because of the reach that they have.
She claims that Stuff has the same reach as Facebook. That is just in its own fallacy. While Stuff is fourth in Alexa rankings behind Google, Facebook and YouTube, it's also true that their time on site, the very metric that radio and television advertising is measured by, and also how online advertising is measured, is actually quite pathetic in comparison. Google's is 13 minutes 20 seconds, Facebook is 17 minutes 53 seconds, YouTube is 13 minutes 13 seconds, and Stuff is a measly 5 minutes and 6 seconds in comparison. In those same Alexa rankings, the BFD comes in 5th place behind Stuff, the New Zealand Herald, TVNZ and Newshub, and well ahead of media darlings Newsroom and the Spin-Off. The key difference that Sinead Bosher fails to understand is the granularity of information provided to ad buyers that Google and Facebook offer. That and the ability to target, very precisely, the demographics or interest groups advertisers wish to target. She then laughably claims that they operate with a strong code of ethics and are highly trustworthy with accuracy, truth and balance. Now ask anybody who's been targeted by these vultures if that holds true, and you'll witness someone literally laughing themselves to death. You just have to look at our daily stuff-ups to see that that is a fallacy. Watching New Zealand Herald editor Shane Curry on the bludge for government handouts provided me with an element of schadenfreude, as it was Shane Curry and his lickspittles who booed my winning of a Canon Media Award. Ironically, his journalists have gone on jihads against corporates in receipt of government largesse and corporates enjoying lower tax thresholds, all the while their company was in court for their own tax arrangements. To now see them with the begging bowl out is somewhat contrary to their previous positions. Their begging for the government to allow the swallowing up of Stuff strikes me as opportunistic and mercenary, while at the same time asking for and in some cases taking government funding to stay afloat. Shane Curry too puts the boot into Google.
Well, I like the moves that have just been announced in France, and France is the first major country to move in this direction. I think Australia will follow very quickly, but last week it was announced that France has ordered that the Google, especially in targeting Google in the first instance, that they now need to start negotiating with media companies to pay them for the content that appears in their search engine. Right. And I think that is a really significant move. The ACCC in Australia was certainly making similar recommendations along those lines, and they're moving ahead this year. And I think, it can't come soon enough in New Zealand.
So, Shane Curry wants to be paid for the content his organisation willingly handed over to Google in the first place. If that happens, then it'll be Stuff who will benefit more than NZME, because they have a more Google-friendly URL structure than the Herald's gobbledygook of code and question marks, putting the Herald on the back foot again because of their own short-sighted business decisions. There is a constant theme here that Google and Facebook should pay a fair share for the content that is provided by media organisations. That is the content that those same media organisations willingly feed into Google and Facebook. I think it's important to discuss how incredibly stupid major media organisations have been in handing their audiences over to Google and Facebook. The fact they did it willingly is even more stupid, and for them to cry over spilt milk now their business model is exposed for the failure it is laughable. They've relied on Google and Facebook to distribute their rubbish, but more importantly in doing so, they handed their audience to them as well by shutting down their own comment sections. Instead, comments and therefore the news ecosystem has moved from their own sites onto Google and Facebook. Now that's one reason why we don't allow comments on Facebook, instead preferring to create a community of interest on our own site. When you hand your audience over, you also hand over your advertising revenue. And again, these fools are telling the politicians they want something done about that which they willingly gave away. Shane Curry reiterates what other submitters have said, that they'd rather the government spends ad dollars with them rather than with Google and Facebook. And he says this in the very next breath after just admitting he handed his audience to Google and Facebook. Essentially, they're looking for the state to replace their ad revenues, and then they effectively become the propaganda wing for whichever government is in power. I'm not convinced we need another red radio. Watching Mark Jennings moan about the failure of advertising because of Facebook and Google was again an exercise in schadenfreude, as I had a meeting with Mark Jennings and Melanie Reid in 2014 where we discussed new media enterprises. And in that meeting, I discussed with them the dangers of handing over your audience to global social media platforms. Clearly he wasn't listening to me then, and he's failed to understand it now. But the most hilarious comment he made was about clickbait and the loss of integrity.
One of the issues pre-COVID has been the failure of the advertising model, which has been discussed this morning. And that's come about because of the emergence of the social media platforms, their dominance. I think Gavin Ellis put the revenue at about 70% that they were taking. The advertising people that I speak to put it at 80 to 90%. So I think the problem is even higher than probably has been recognised. One of the things that's happened with this model is that there has been extreme competition for the small amount that is left over and available. And because advertisers buy on traffic numbers, that's readers, viewers, listeners, it's led to this phenomenon of what we call clickbait, as you'll all be aware of in your jobs. And that's led to some loss of reputation for some media organisations.
This is the same Mark Jennings who presided over gotcha journalism at MediaWorks and has carried on with the same tactics at Newsroom. You only have to look at the carry-on over Jamie Lee Ross that was driven by Paula Bennett working in conjunction with Melanie Reid at Newsroom, where innuendo and mistruths were blown up and conflated into a large gotcha story at the expense of people's lives and mental well-being. That he can sit there and talk of loss of reputation and say that with a straight face says all that you need to know about where his ethics and integrity lies. He too was on the bludge asking for his donations or subscriptions to either be tax deductible and or matching those donations dollar for dollar. Clearly his existing business model is shaky if it needs subsidies from the government. So too his suggestion to extend New Zealand on air. That is just extending welfare for media bludgers. He gives a very curious answer to a line of questioning from David Seymour, however.
What does the model look like to try and have public funding going to an entity that then does journalistic funding, but remains truly independent in a sustainable way? I just can't figure out what the solution to that is, but if we could, then we might have solved the problem.
Yeah, I think you're right, David. I think it is hard, and we don't want too much government interference in the media, frankly, or political interference.
So Mark Jennings doesn't want government interference, except, of course, if that interference is the government dumping large wedges of taxpayers' money into their pockets. And speaking of taxpayers' money, the spin-off submission was interesting. Essentially, they run a cash-for-content model, and again, ironically, they're using a business model that Nicky Hager and his media enablers railed against in 2014. The spin-off has already availed themselves of taxpayer largesse, so it was no surprise to hear Duncan Grieve wishing for a bigger trough funded by new digital media taxes to be levelled on Google and Facebook. MP Michael Woodhouse made a pertinent observation, one that escaped the notice of the self-serving media spokespeople, and that is advertisers don't place their advertising to benefit media outlets. They place them to benefit their own interests. The final part of the committee was more commentary from Gavin Ellis and was full of poor assumptions, self-serving drivel and aggressive finger-pointing.
Well, I think it does. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it does confirm that the crisis is a real one, that the cash flow crisis is the first element to be addressed. I was interested in a comment, I think it was Michael Anderson said, we can't see the bottom of the cliff, we need some certainty. And I think one of the things the government needs to do as a matter of great urgency, and I'm hoping that the Minister's statements that he says is due later this week will provide some of that certainty around dealing with the real problems of cash flow. You heard some of the numbers that they talked about. No industry can sustain a drop in revenue of that dimension without it being catastrophic.
So this clown is making the case that no business can sustain a revenue drop like that experienced by media, but also that they're so special and therefore are more deserving than any other business to be propped up by large dump trucks full of taxpayer cash being upended into their vaults before any other businesses. The truly sad part of committee submissions is that apart from Michael Woodhouse, Melissa Lee, and heroic interjections by David Seymour, the rest of the committee seems to be in lockstep down the path of treating these media lovies like they're special, when in fact they're very ordinary, have failed and failing business models, but seemingly deserve to be bestowed literally millions of dollars of taxpayer-funded kindness to prop those failures up. David Seymour rightly questions this and is met with a fact-free and vitriolic response from Gavin Ellis.
We've now had at least 3 chief executives of major media organisations come and try to tell us that we don't need to advertise on Facebook or Google to reach everybody. Well, if that's true, why have their key account managers not made that case to people purchasing advertising already? And I just worry that, there's too much paternalism here. The fact is, people can make up their own mind. They will choose. And ultimately, we're going to have to be competitive in our mindset rather than just saying that the fact people choose to look at advertising and get information off social media platforms is a bad thing. So it's not really a question, more of a challenge. I think that.
Well, let me answer the challenge, because I think that you miss out one key ingredient. What other industry is allowed to steal the product of another industry's endeavour and pay nothing for it, and at the same time steal their livelihood through advertising? Because that's what social media does. They pay absolutely nothing for the product that is the lifeblood of their operation, and that is the news content made and paid for by news media organisations. Now, I know of no other industry where you can steal something and not only get paid for it through advertising, but get the government's backing for it as well.
It was just as well they were using Zoom, because if the meeting was in real life, I suspect most of the committee would have been covered in spittle from Gavin Ellis. He is, of course, quite wrong. Social media companies do not steal the content. The media companies freely give it away to them through Google News feeds and links to Facebook. The issue is in their own control. They could simply stop feeding the beast. But the problem is they've done it for so long and for free that they've conditioned and trained their audience to live in the social media ecosystem rather than their own. The problem lies with the focus of media companies, and that is that they've toadied to their advertisers and not listened to their audience. That is the reason subscriptions are down, that people aren't buying newspapers, and a reason why conservative media outlets are thriving. CNN is tanking, but Fox News is growing. The media are as dishonest with themselves as they are to their audience. It isn't the fault of Google and Facebook that they're struggling. It is the fault of decades of not very smart people making poor business decisions. Let them fail. Something will rise in their place. Mass media has only really existed since 1845 with the advent of the telegraph, radio since the 20s, and television since the 1930s. The internet is just another iteration, but these clowns just want to continue with their advertiser-centric models as though nothing has ever changed. With the sole exception of their submission from Radio New Zealand, the rest were self-serving and thoroughly undeserving of any further consideration. How these people became the good and the mighty of media companies is beyond me. They showed a distinct lack of forethought, planning, or business acumen, and their so-called solutions are just a continuation of welfare for media lovies. They need to fail, because if they don't, then they'll continue with their failed business models. It will be interesting to see a public poll in a few days. I strongly suspect that National will be hurt badly. Simon Bridges has not used his exposure in the Epidemic Response Committee well. He's appeared dead set thick as a brick, shallow and far too light-hearted, cracking lame and pathetic jokes. The more this committee is broadcast, the worse it is going to get for Bridges. Which leads me to wonder just what his caucus sees in him. The man we are seeing in the committee meetings is the man the MPs see in their day-to-day work. He is distinctly underwhelming. How on earth can they say he's the best that they've got? In any case, the proof is in the poll numbers, and they aren't flash. We're staring down the barrel of a 2002-sized failure from National. Meanwhile, the media have not covered themselves with glory this week. They have shown how self-serving and venal they really are. They are experiencing what every other business has experienced, but for some reason they are making the case that they are more important than any other business when it comes to getting large bailouts from the government. There will be many small business owners who have seen their life's work destroyed by the lockdown, sitting and asking themselves why the government isn't bailing their businesses out, like media are asking for. Those media enterprises with a strong and resilient business model will survive. Those without should be allowed to fail. The market will fill the temporary void. It always does. This is Cam Slater, and you've been listening to Insight Politics. Thank you for tuning in.